In this video, we'll talk about the racial abilities of perhaps the most iconic, or at least the most played race in WoW, the Blood Elves. Added in the Burning Crusade alongside the Draenor, they have since become the most popular race in the game. And while their racials are pretty good, it is mostly because of how they look, as to this day, they are one of the prettiest races in the game, and the first pretty race added to the Horde. Before the Burning Crusade, the Horde only had monster races to choose from, and actually had a lower population as a result. Adding Blood Elves to the Horde in the Burning Crusade single-handedly evened out the ratios, and was the start of the Horde's larger overall numbers. Turns out, aesthetics are somewhat important to a lot of players. Anyways, starting out with the actual racials, nice and simple with an ability that, much like the Human's Diplomacy racial, has never changed since it was added to the game. And that is Arcane Affinity. This gave Blood Elves a plus 10 to the enchanting profession should they decide to be enchanters. Next we have their Resistance racial, though this Resistance racial is a bit special. Blood Elves got the Magic Resistance ability. Now, while most Resistance racials gave plus 10 to a specific school of magic, Magic Resistance gave Blood Elves a plus 5 to every school of magic. At least every school of magic that had a resistance stat, as there was no player character holy resistance in the game. Now, moving on to the most iconic of the racials, let's talk about Arcane Torrent. At launch, Arcane Torrent was an 8-yard silence on a 2-minute cooldown that also restored mana based on the number of mana tap stacks you had. Which brings us to the last racial from the Burning Crusade, that being Mana Tap. Mana Tap had a 30-second cooldown, and reduced the target's mana by a little bit. It also gave you a buff that lasted for 10 minutes and stacked up to 3 times, each stack increasing the amount of mana the Arcane Torrent granted. Mana Tap itself cost 0 mana and was instant cast, which gave it some interesting uses in PvP. If a healer is trying to rest and drink and regen mana, you can just hit them with Mana Tap as it had a 30-yard range, reducing their mana and also keeping them in combat longer so that you could close the distance before they can really regain their mana. It's also worth noting, however, that Mana Tap did not work on any targets that did not have mana, be that player or NPC. Without a mana bar, it wouldn't do anything, so it wasn't super reliable if you wanted a ranged way to pull mobs on a melee character. In the cinematic for the Burning Crusade, when you first see the Blood Elf and she sucks the mana out of the mana worm killing it, that is what Mana Tap did in lore. Moving on to Wrath of the Lich King, we will start off with Magic Resistance, which suddenly became the strongest resistance racial ever. It could be argued that it gave more resistances back in the Burning Crusade too, but I think it really hit its peak here, as all resistance racials were changed from giving a plus 10 to a single resistance stat, or in the case of Magic Resistance, a plus 5 to a resistance stat, to now reducing the chance to be hit by spells of that school by 2%. But while the Frost Resistance of the Dwarf racial reduced the chance to be hit by frost spells by 2%, and the Undead Shadow Resistance reduced the chance to be hit by Shadow Resistance by 2%, the Blood Elves Magic Resistance reduced the chance to be hit by all spells by 2%, no matter what the school the incoming spell came from. Moving on to Mana Tap, it was removed from the game, and the mana gained from Arcane Torrent became baseline. No need for stacking the Mana Tap buff. They did give a lore reason for it though, saying that with the Sunwell reignited, the Blood Elves no longer needed to tap mana from other creatures. Though, despite its removal early on, it is still referenced in the game to this day, with the female Blood Elf / flirt emote.
My Mana Tap brings all the boys to the yard.
Which is pretty interesting given how long ago it was removed. Arcane Torrent had quite a number of changes throughout Wrath. As stated before with Mana Tap's removal, it now gave a flat amount of mana when used. Though in a patch early on, silences were changed to have diminishing returns, and this included Arcane Torrent. In patch 3.2, in addition to its silence effect, it now also applied a 3-second interrupt effect when used on NPCs, so that it was now usable in creatures that were immune to silence effects. This did not have any extra effects in PvP though, as it only affected non-player characters to give Blood Elves a way to interrupt bosses. Though funnily enough, the tooltip for it was not updated to reflect this change until patch 3.3. At which time the cast bar UI was changed to properly reflect that, yes, Arcane Torrent was interrupting things. The Cataclysm was light on changes for Blood Elves. Really, there was only one. Magic Resistance was removed and replaced with Arcane Resistance. And as with all resistance racials, it was changed to give a scaling amount of Arcane Resistance based on your character's level in Cataclysm. But Arcane Resistance is a specific stat, so they no longer got resistance to all schools of magic. And it was now just arcane magic that they resisted. Which was a pretty fair change, since it was the best resistance racial in the game's history to this point. It was now just in line with all the other resistance racials. Mists of Pandaria gave two pretty simple changes. Arcane Resistance was changed along with all the other resistance racials to just give a flat 1% reduction to a specific damage type. In the Blood Elves case, it was a 1% damage reduction from arcane damage. The other change in Mists of Pandaria came to the Arcane Torrent racial in 5.1. A blue post of the patch stated Arcane Torrent now returns 2% base mana, was previously an unintended 6%. So a pretty significant nerf all things considered, no longer making it one of the best races to pick as certain healers. In Warlords of Draenor, the Blood Elves got a new racial in the form of Arcane Acuity, which increased their critical chance by 1%, and hey, getting something for free is just fine. Not a huge boost, but a boost nonetheless, as they were trying to give all racials an actual DPS increase to kind of even them out more here. The other change going into WoD was Arcane Torrent again. It now gives Death Knights 20 runic power instead of 15, and gave Paladins 1 holy power instead of just mana, for the specs that didn't care about the mana return. It now also gave 3% mana to mages, priests, and warlocks, up from 2% from MoP. Then in patch 6.2.2, they reduced the cooldown from 2 minutes it had in TBC all the way down to 1.5 minutes. Again, a welcome change. From here on out, the only changes to Blood Elves racials are tweaks to Arcane Torrent. At the start of Legion, it was changed to now give mana to Holy and Protection Paladins instead of Holy Power, though Retribution Paladins still got the Holy Power. Then in patch 7.1, it now generated 15 Insanity for Shadow Priests. The last change came is when we went to Zandalar and Kulturas, where in Battle for Azeroth, it was reworked entirely to now be an effect like a Purge. It now removes one beneficial magical effect from all enemies in range instead of being a silence. Now, many people saw this as a nerf, as a silence is really good, way better than an AoE purge. But, while it was changed, Blizzard also added in a few places where it was very useful. At the start of one of the dungeons in King's Rest, there was a bunch of little abomination ads that had really low HP, but a buff that gave them a shield with a whole bunch of extra HP. However, if a Blood Elf could run in and just pop Arcane Torrent, you could kill all of them really easily. The only other way to kill all these ads at once was a mass dispel from a priest. These mobs also showed up in the first raid of the expansion, Uldir, where during the Prophet Zul boss fight, Zul would summon a group of these ads, which would either require a mass dispel or a Blood Elf to go over and deal with them. So while Purge effects isn't as useful as a silence, Blizzard made sure the Blood Elves still had a use for it to ease the blow, and kept adding important effects that are better to be purged going forward. Basically, Blizzard knew a whole bunch of players were Blood Elves, and they didn't want to nerf their racials, so they made sure that the racial would be useful by just adding in purgeable effects. Alright, and that's the video. Blood Elves are still the most well-known race in WoW, despite not always having the best racials in the game. They are one of the prettiest, and therefore the most played race in the game, even to this day. So if you like this video and have ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. And be honest, you play Blood Elf, don't you?